But to that theme of bridging between also the system and the personal, we'd like to start with an intro question to get to know our speakers. You'll hear a lot about their work, and I'll also drop in the chat a link to their full bios, so we want to make sure that you can have that background. But to start off somewhere personal, we want to start with this question, and we invite the audience as well to participate in this. Share your name, an example of a way you're connected across rural and urban communities. And that doesn't necessarily have to be about your work. It can be through your family, your friendships, your music, or your art interests. And I'll kick us off. My name is Emmet Almadon. I'm a research analyst at the Othering and Belonging Institute. I use she, her pronouns, and we're trying to make an effort to make sure to describe ourselves to the audience, in particular for visually impaired folks. And so I'll start us off with that. I am a light-skinned Black woman with curly black hair piled up on top of my head. I'm wearing a collared shirt with blue and white stripes and a lot of gold. Happy. One way I'm connected across rural and urban communities is just through my upbringing. I come from a family of immigrants that we kind of made our home in America in rural towns in Ohio and Georgia. And so that's just, it's a very special place to me. And it was so much of my childhood was commuting from rural and urban places to keep those connections in my immigrant community going. So that's what came up for me. I'll pass it to our speakers to go in the very order we see on the screen. So I'll kick it to you, Adam.
Thank you so much. Yeah, my name is Adam Krueger. I use he, him pronouns, and really joy to be here today. And I'm sort of connected across rural and urban communities. My family, when we migrated to this country, we lived in a really small town in southern Illinois, Riverton, Illinois, and my family were coal miners. At the time, it was the largest coal mine and the most profitable coal mine in the country, and they were part of a thing in our history known as the coal mining wars. And then after the coal mining wars, my family all moved to Chicago and lived on the west side of Chicago, and I was born on the north side. And so sort of my family has always sort of lived in between, like urban and rural spaces. Yeah, so it's a real joy to be here. And this, cannot think of a more important thing for us to be talking about together. So really grateful for everyone.
Thank you, Adam. I decided to stop sharing screen just so we can see each other. Monica, thank you so much for joining. I know you're just able to get on, but you're just in time because we're about to move into our introductions, and you were next on our list here of just sharing your name and an example of a way that you're connected across rural and urban communities.
Peace and blessings, everyone. My name is Monica Lewis Patrick, and I have the honor and privilege of serving as the president and CEO of We the People of Detroit. And for me, our rural connections really happened a few years ago when we were really trying to expand the conversation around water affordability in Michigan. And we know that 40% of the water that is provided in Michigan comes by way of the city of Detroit, Detroit Water and Sewage Department. But it was in a conversation with a group of rural farmers in Michigan, where they shared with me that they did not relate to unaffordable water rates because their water was affordable. But what we had done is we had done our homework, and we knew that some of the chemicals that they were purchasing, the cost of those chemicals had gone up over 200% since 2008. And we were able to share that as an unaffordable issue. And so through those conversations, it really grew our network and our relationships with rural partners to build sensitivity, to also really try to bridge this racial divide in Michigan that really bifurcates the issues of water, both along geographies of rural and urban, but also along racial lines. And so as we've worked more collaboratively with our rural partners, we've really been heavily educated on how important consolidation is to some of our rural partners across the country. Also able to share with them how consolidation has been weaponized and deeply racialized in some of our communities. And so we believe that that connective tissue of being able to use water to connect communities, both rural, urban, and suburban, really will move not only the nation in the right direction, but it'll move the planet in the right direction.
Thank you, Monica. Thank you. Thanks everyone in the chat. Keep it coming. We love hearing these connections. I'll pass to Magali.
Hello, everyone. My name is Magali Licoli. I am the Executive Director of Venceremos, a nonprofit organization, a grassroots organization in Arkansas. So my connection to the urban world is I am from Mexico, from León, Guanajuato. I grew up in a city with over 2 million people. And also my background is theater. So because I was pursuing that career since I was in Mexico, I moved to Mexico City to continue my career. So now I live in Arkansas. It's been 17 years, and it was shocking at the beginning because obviously it's a big change of culture, of country, of language, and also moving into a wide rural area was shocking. Right now, because I've been here for 17 years, I work a lot of kind of bringing the message to the urban, because a lot of people living in the urban don't understand the interconnections that we have and how we depend upon the work that many people do in rural communities. And sometimes we as an urban people, we tend to demonize or to undermine the efforts of what people do in the rural areas. And we tend to be more of like, we know more, we are more educated, and so that is just not the truth. And so now my work coming from two of those worlds, different worlds, I do a lot of work of connecting people to the work that we do here in Arkansas, and I'm so happy to be here to share what we are doing currently here. Thank you.
Thank you, Magali. We'll pass to Mad next.
Yeah, no, I've got it. I should know that by now. I'm Mab, she, her. I'm a white woman, gray hair, glasses on, and kind of looming out of a black background because I couldn't find the cord that would give me better light, but I think this will do. So I'm connected across urban and rural communities because my father grew up on a farm in the country in Macon County, Alabama, and my mother was a city girl in Tuskegee, about 10 miles away. So that transit of 10 miles between those two has really marked tensions, class tensions, and really race tensions too, although we're all white in my family, that have played across decades too. I myself would be aware more of these from the town as the civil rights movement really erupted around me and showed me the contradictions in my family. And that eventually precipitated my own migrations out of the South and out of what I felt were very constrictive arrangements, knowing myself not yet to be a lesbian, which I was able to find out when I got to graduate school at Duke. So my trajectory then has been towards the urban and towards what George Wallace would call the pointy-headed intellectual, but always very firmly rooted in community and still trying in myself, in the communities I work in, to work across these contradictions in a climate that is frankly increasingly difficult to do. So I'm really happy to be here with all of you talking about these really crucial issues of belonging, otherness, and how we keep making ourselves more human. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Mab. Passing on to Veronica.
Good afternoon, and thank you so much for the opportunity to be here with all of these great people. My name is Veronica Womack. I serve as the Executive Director of the Rural Studies Institute at Georgia College and State University, and I have multiple connections between urban and rural. I grew up in the rural Black Belt of Alabama and went to a university in an urban area, and that was my first time really realizing the uniqueness of of my cultural heritage, the uniqueness of rural people and rural places. And it set me on the path to do the work that I'm doing right now. Many of my family moved from rural communities to urban areas seeking better economic opportunities or freedom or the ability to be politically independent historically. And now many of my family and friends do the same thing, I guess, go to urban areas where they believe opportunities will be greater. And so my work has also helped me to bridge this connection or disconnect between rural and urban because I see it as central to my work to change the narrative about rural Southern people, in particular, folks from the Black Belt. And I'm actually drawn as a Generation Xer to urban areas for the music scene, the art, the food, and all of that, as well as some of the farming communities that have been so vibrant there. I'm a middle-aged African-American woman with gray hair. I'll say it's salt and pepper, but it's increasingly gray. I have black framed glasses, and I wear a lot of stone jewelry. So I hope that description is okay. And I have she, her pronouns. Yes.
Thank you.
When you came on, I said, man, I have some folks in Detroit. I got to make sure that we may be related.
Connections happening
Yes.
live. We love it.
Yes.
I'll pass to Eli to close out introductions and as our moderator to take over from here.
Hello, everyone. My name is Eli Moore. I'm a program director at the Othering and Belonging Institute, and I'm based in California. I go by he or him. Let's see, I'm a white-skinned, brown beard, short brown hair, wearing a dark sweater, sitting in a tall blue chair with a red curtain behind me. And my connections to rural, I grew up kind of in the Bay Area urban environment, and some of my family is based in small town rural California, and so I spent a lot of time going there and spending time and trying to make sense of those two worlds. Talk a little bit about that. So I want to open this up with just a few thoughts on why building urban-rural bridges is so important. And if you want to put on the slides, that'd be great. So you're probably here because you have some sense that we in urban communities and we in rural communities are interconnected, that our destinies are tied together, that we rely on each other, whether we recognize it and honor it or not. It's clear in the air we breathe. So where I live in San Francisco Bay Area, the ink that turned the sun orange for days came from wildfires hundreds of miles away in mountain communities. The water coming from the tap travels through pipelines and canals from its rural sources. In rural communities, the products on the shelves have been trucked in from ports in the cities. The food being grown is shipped to urban communities. Next slide, please. Our identities and our families often bridge these divides, as we've already been talking about. Who lives in a city but has grandparents or great-grandparents who lived their lives in the country? Who lives in a rural community but has cousins in the city? Who has said or heard a loved one say, my family used to be farmers? Who lives in the country but listens to music made by urban artists? You can go to the next slide. Oh, maybe the slides aren't working. So we're deeply connected, but we're also mutually misunderstood, right? Which is why we need these conversations. And this misunderstanding is cultivated and strategically exploited to distract us from pathways to a better future. Endless political stereotypes are rolled out and exploited, like the inner city is the problem, or backwards country people are the problem. So we've been sold these false solutions that pit us against each other and are deeply harmful. And I want to just zero in on the legal system as one example. Mass incarceration in urban communities of color cannot be separated from economic underdevelopment in rural areas. So over the last century, corporations have consolidated control of agriculture, meaning there are fewer farms than ever before, and they're bigger than ever before. This created an employment crisis in rural communities as the number of people working on farms went from 10 million to only 3 million. So rural elites chose prison constructions as a solution. More than half of all rural counties in the US added prison work to their available employment mix during the last 2 decades of the century. Between 1970 and 2010, 1,140 prisons and jails were built across the United States. This led one study to conclude that the prison functions as a state-sponsored public works program for disadvantaged rural communities, but also supports perverse economic incentives for prison proliferation. So mass incarceration was sold as a way to make urban communities safer and rural communities more economically vibrant. But in fact, it produced enormous harm along profoundly racist lines to communities who have been criminalized and incarcerated. Reduce the political power of these communities by counting incarcerated people in the areas where they are imprisoned. And in fact, it's had mixed and largely negative effects on rural economies and communities. So to win both justice for either rural or urban communities will take building systems that work for both communities. Reimagining public safety and ending mass incarceration means dramatically scaling back the prisons. Yet rural communities, like here in California, Susanville, California, are passionately fighting against the closure of the prison that they host because they see no viable alternative that would produce the living wages and benefits that prison work does. Communities hit hardest by mass incarceration also need a major investment in living wage jobs. So what does it look like to invest in the communities most impacted by incarceration and the communities economically dependent on mass incarceration? If we don't do one without the other, the suffering will persist and the solutions will depend on a fragile arrangement of exclusion. This is just one example of the way that creating a more fair and inclusive future will rely on rural and urban bridges. We can think this way about the water crisis, food insecurity, education, and other issues and visions for transformation. So we're really lucky to have this amazing group of folks here today who have been doing this work and tell us about what it looks like and what are some of the challenges and insights and strategies that they found useful. So thank you all for joining us. And I'm gonna give you a quick overview of the agenda, which is we're gonna have kind of two sets of conversations. So we're gonna right now get into what are some of the interdependencies, interconnectedness, and the misconceptions across these boundaries. And then we're going to get into what are some of the models and strategies for bridging. And we have a board, which is a kind of interactive way for everybody in the audience to add your own thoughts to these questions. So if you just put in the chat, it'll take you to a web page, and you can add a sticky note that allows you to type up your thoughts, and they'll appear on the page. The sticky note, it looks like a square with some lines. If you click on it, So you can go ahead and keep adding things in the chat or onto the Jamboard. All right, so let's get into the discussion. So is my voice breaking up a little bit?
Yeah.
Okay. Don't know what I could.
We got you. We can make it out. It's okay. It's all right. Oh, we just
Maybe the
Yeah.
headphones. I don't know.
So Magali, I want to pass it to you. You've been working with poultry workers, and during the pandemic, we saw both kind of our interdependency with our food chain, and we saw how food chain workers were exploited and made vulnerable. And I wanted to ask you about what you've seen in that work as far as how those communities, those workers are connected to urban consumers or urban communities, and what some of the work is there around those connections.
Yes, thank you so much. Well, I think it's important to understand a little bit of the context of why this work are performed in white rural areas. And well, I want to start with saying that Arkansas is the home of Tyson Foods and other big companies such Walmart. Arkansas is a corporate state, but also is a right-to-work state. And with almost 3,000 workers processing, poultry processing is the 5th largest employer in the state and responsible for more than 10% of US poultry meat. And also it's important to understand that many of these workers come from Mexico, from Central America, from the Marshall Islands. A lot of them also are Black workers. And now the state is receiving a lot of refugees from many different countries in Europe, in Africa, and Central America. And I said this because most of the processing plants across the country are located in these white rural areas. And immigration in Arkansas happened because of the need of these jobs. Actually, Tyson has history of smuggling illegally Mexicans to come to work into these processing plants. And whenever the workers come into a white rural space where the only option, or mostly the only option they have, is to work in these processing plants, it has a reason, because this company needs vulnerable workers to exploit. They need workers that don't understand the language, that don't understand their rights, that are locked up in these jobs because they don't have any more options. So the urban communities depend on the work that is done in the white rural areas, that mostly these workers see themselves powerless. In Arkansas, because Tyson is located here, there is a lot of influence in the society, in the politics, that pretty much left workers thinking that they don't have power to fight. And so Venceremos exists precisely because of that, because I began working since 2013. I was working as in a community clinic where we received most of these workers who are already disabled for life, that have respiratory problems, that have amputations, that have inability to find other jobs because of the long-term effects of working in these processing plants. Whenever I saw that, I knew that it was a systemic problem, that it was not an isolated case, that nobody in the community wanted to talk about that these workers will remain in the shadows, and nobody else in the urban communities knew how the chicken is being processed, because these stories are being silenced in these communities where a lot of there is a lot of racism and a lot of dynamics that prevent that these workers speak up. So through my job of finding solutions and really organizing workers, I knew that the only solution was that workers had to empower themselves, that we had to allow that to happen, that workers had to be in the front lines of the fight, because I am not a processing workers. I don't know what issues I face, but workers know what the issues they face and what the solutions can be. And so for me, coming from the urban, I had to humble myself and to say, I mean, I have education. I learned how to speak English as my second language, but I don't know until I fight alongside with them to find the solution. So workers during the pandemic, yeah, everybody knew about what was happening at the processing plants, but these issues, the persistent working conditions, led to a catastrophe during the pandemic, because workers work shoulder to shoulder, because workers are exposed to high amount of chemicals, because workers already had respiratory problems. So whenever we saw the pandemic coming to the country, you cannot see, and I will never forget the faces of poultry workers coming to me terrified and saying and asking, what is going to happen to us? We are exposed to die, we're exposed to get sick, because these workers don't have basic leave, because these workers get punished for missing work while being sick, because there is this punitive system that punishes workers sick. So all of these conditions were before the pandemic, and obviously when the pandemic hit the country, were immediately at higher risk than any other workers, that they were exposed to die, they were exposed to get sick, because the companies use that vulnerability to push workers to the maximum to keep working. Even the line speed increased during the pandemic to 174 birds per minute. The US government didn't do anything to protect these workers. OSHA only gave some guidelines suggesting guidelines to these meat companies, but was never reinforceable. And so we in Arkansas, I didn't have any other option but to say, look, we need to fight. We need to organize. We need to come together. We need to fight, because there is no other option but to fight. And so we were exposing the stories of workers. We've been exposing what is happening. We've been exposing Tyson, because they have invested millions in PR campaign that doesn't land into the workers' reality. The corporate social responsibility model is a failure to workers. And so I'm here to explain a little bit about the solutions, and I'm happy to respond to any questions you may have, because we keep organizing workers, doing direct actions inside the plants. For the first time, poultry workers in Arkansas went on a strike on December of 2020. And I said this because we live in a very hostile environment to organize, but workers didn't see themselves then just to fight, because there was no option or to die or to fight. And Venceremos created the space for workers to fight. And so we are very proud of what we have achieved. And really it's just bringing the workers trust to keep building efforts to fight. Thank you.
Such powerful work, and thank you for making it visible and giving us a story. Veronica, your
you're breaking up. We can't hardly hear you. You're breaking. Okay.
Okay. Sorry about that.
Yeah.
So Veronica, your work highlights the legacy of African American farmers in the Black Belt region of the South.
Mm-hmm.
What are the legacies of urban and rural communities coming together, or the connections there, particularly in the Black Belt region, and what have the institutional practices that have excluded Black farmers done to those connections?
Okay. Thank you again for giving me the opportunity to be here. There's so many misconceptions about the Black Belt region. As I shared earlier, my realization of that happened while I was at a university. There was an overall consensus that there was nothing in the Black Belt region. And so, nothing of value. And so I've really dedicated my work to changing that perspective. African American farmers in particular are very, very important historically and present to the Black Belt region. Historically, the connection between urban and rural communities within the Black Belt has been a very extractive relationship, to be quite honest. So historically, you had this, enslaved free labor within the Black Belt that was used to fuel development in many of our urban communities. The Black Belt region has often provided natural resources, raw resources for other people's development. And so because of that, many African Americans were residing in communities that were not invested in. And so many of us had to leave. Those of us that stayed in agriculture, many of those farmers were seen as a threat because they were some of the few economically independent people within the Black Belt, right? So the Black Belt had a history of an agricultural economy, which meant that if you owned land, you had the ability to create generational wealth. So that I just wanted to kind of give a backdrop of that. So this connection of migration of people, the extraction of resources, the forcing out of people and what they could have shared within the Black Belt community. People often think of rural people going into urban areas as people arriving with empty vessels. Well, let me tell you, the Black Belt is in Detroit, it's in Chicago, it's in any urban place, and we have definitely made our imprint there. Some of the institutional practices, however, that have excluded Black agricultural workers or Black farmers, there's a whole host of it. So right now, in terms of markets and having access to markets in urban areas, there is a growing need to build those relationships, to make them stronger, so that as we support African American farmers, that they have markets in urban areas that they are able to, to sell their products. The grocery store chains, you have hospitals and educational institutions that often want fresh fruits and vegetables. Well, African American farmers can provide that, but we need access to market. We need access to processing facilities. We need access to capital to sustain our farms and to grow our businesses, not just Black farmers, but also businesses across the board. We also have had a history of discriminatory practices, not only in terms of your traditional lending agencies, but also USDA and our access to the services, the resources, the programs that could have assisted African American farmers. And so part of this is an exclusion. A lot of development policy is created in urban spaces. And so we often have people speaking on our behalf who really don't know the Black Belt, who really don't know how it is structured historically and present, how business is often done in rural communities. And so, it's important that when we talk about development policy or bridging the gap, that we have folks at the table that can look around the table and see who's missing. A lot of federal policy that impacts rural people are unfortunately created by folks who have very little understanding of rural places. And I think you talked a little bit, Eli, about the prison system and how rural communities hosted prisoners that often came from urban areas. Well, part of that, as a political scientist, is what we see in the political environment, right? Because those bodies are counted in rural places where they cannot vote. And so our political representation is very interesting and may be counter to what some of those bodies would choose for policy. So I think that the connection between urban and rural is a very unique one. I would like people to walk away from this conversation understanding that the Black Belt is a region that extends from eastern Texas to the eastern shores of Virginia, typically categorized as the old Confederate South. We have always had a lot to contribute. We've typically been ridden out of the American version of agrarianism, but we've always been there. And so we are eager to connect with urban markets. We'd like to work with philanthropic organizations that understand the uniqueness of the Black Belt and are willing to help build capacity here. And I guess my last point will be that traditional practices of development have to be changed. We have to have a more inclusive approach to working on developing states and our nation as a whole that include rural people and Black Belt people in particular. So I'll stop there.
So, Matt, let's turn to you for many years of
Hey, Eli, now the audio is not coming through, unfortunately.
Yeah, you may have to put it in the chat.
Yeah, maybe we can switch for a bit and see if we can figure out the audio. There's a suggestion that it might be the headphones, but I'll move us to our next question. Thank you so much, Veronica, for walking us through that, and we've been dropping links in the chat as well. But yeah, just the different institutions that you walked us through, understanding the impact that that's had on the Black Belt region and these rich connections that should continue to be nurtured. So thank you for that. We're going to move into a question for Mab. So Mab, your work over the past 40 years has explored how race, sexuality, citizenship, religion, and more can be used to divide, but also that these identities and changing identities can hold so much potential for solidarity. For those that saw Mab's bio on the website, we linked to a recent piece that we really recommend checking out, in particular on how in North Carolina, there's been research done by Mab and others in Anti-Racist Research Collaborative on specifically the role of white nationalists and white supremacists in exploiting these divides. And so, you know, these are differences that can be exploited by politicians, by extremists, and by each other. So we'd love to hear you speak a little bit on what you've learned in researching, as well as countering those narratives and those calls to violence.
Well, like others, I'm really glad to be in these conversations and finding them taking me back to different points in my life. I'm 72 now, and I think I got us to North Carolina in graduate school in terms of my own migrations. And I think migratory patterns have a lot to do with understanding more complexity about urban and rural as more than divides, as roots and roots. But when I got to North Carolina, I did anti-Klan organizing for about 5 or 6 years because North Carolina had the worst Klan and Nazi groups in the country. And after I came out anyway, I was locating myself politically, and I generally gravitated to these points where othering was being manufactured at the height, I guess. And Klan violence certainly does that. It isolates people. And I was happy to help build a coalition of North Carolinians who work to bring those folks out of isolation, to identify the patterns of Klan and Nazi violence, and to bust at least 2 out of 3 of those groups. And in the old days, we'd put people in jail. So that's, have to think up different approaches these days with abolition. I worked with the Urban Rural Mission, a program of the World Council of Churches that had contact groups on all the continents, and looked at questions of liberatory theology and how it helped to bridge the urban-rural divide and bring that liberation theology into community organizing. I've taught in Connecticut. I came back to North Carolina and doing this work now on tracking the insurrectionists county to county. But in all of that, one of the themes for me is always family and the tensions that are created, I think, in the old days when folks moved out of the country to the city. They moved out of kinship networks to more secular situations, to more anonymous situations, even though many came with family networks too. But that anonymity sometimes allowed different identities and practices to emerge. Certainly, my queerness emerged when I moved away from more rural Alabama. And for many people, I think that's happened. But that urban-rural divide then I think is exacerbated by these differences in secular and spiritual. And that's certainly been exacerbated even more by the migration of the right into evangelical Christianity in 1979 or 80 with the moral majority, and even more so now. In my own family, I've had to negotiate that with my sister and siblings. And and I've always used the language of Jesus. We were born in the Methodist Church. She became Baptist, which made it harder. Won't go into that too much, but the language of Jesus was a way to talk about these things, because don't give me like Leviticus, let's talk about Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But I find that harder to do these days because the Christians these far-right Christians and nationalists don't care about Jesus. I mean, this is the Church of Jesus without Jesus, as Flannery O'Connor would say. And they have points more of power and state power and abortion and all those kind of things. So it makes it much more complicated. And then I also think that these climate crises, though, are going to catapult us into situations where we have to figure out a new arrangement of belonging that is not othering. And we will be put in enough crises together, enough people be washed up on our doorsteps, or we'll be washed up on their doorsteps. The stranger will be among us, and how we greet that stranger and see that stranger is less than strange and really ourselves. And our accelerating vulnerabilities, I think, will determine, in the short term anyway, the lives that people will live. So anyway, I guess I'll stop there. We get to come back around to this again. But I do find, even though in those junctures, there are these exacerbated differences of religion. Like you can't talk economics when somebody else's starting point is, a particular 3 Bible verses that you can't remember if you ever knew them, but I do feel like the spiritual language, the language of humanity, the language of people in the breaches, is the language that generates a different understanding than self and other. And I'm glad that this particular conference and this organization is really locating itself there in those breaches too. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you so much for walking us through that and speaking on just being able to reflect on where our points of reference are coming from and what kind of grounds us. So we're going to turn to Adam and Monica for kind of final responses on this round of questions. So Adam, in your work at People's Action, you helped to build the rural and small town organizing strategy, which has grown into one of the largest progressive rural organizing efforts in the country. And so we're hoping to hear from your work, and then afterwards we'll open the floor to Monica, is hearing from your different perspectives of where you're rooted. What have you heard, Adam, in rural organizing that were surprising ways that urban and rural communities are connected? What myths or misconceptions has this work disrupted?
Yeah, no, this is such a great question. Can y'all hear me? Is my audio okay? Cool. Well, it's a joy to be here, and I just want to keep coming off mute and just say amen and really talk back at people. I just appreciate this panel so much. And just really just to kind of ground it in my own story, my name is Adam Krueger, and I'm on the national staff at People's Action, and I've been organizing for the last 27 years of my life. And it's really, for me, like a sacred vocation. It's really something I've given my whole life to. And I had mentioned a little bit about my connections, and when I would talk to my grandmother about her experiences as a child in rural, Southern Illinois, she told me stories about how every home on her block was firebombed as part of the coal mining wars. And then after we migrated to Chicago, she told me stories in the late 60s in Garfield Park, how every home was burned in the riots in 1968 up until the doors of St. Aloysius Parish. And for me, a lot of what this work is fundamentally about as a country and as a work, it's sort of this, how do we confront this historical amnesia And how can we remember that we really do belong to each other? And I think that's why this is such a powerful, been such a powerful experience for me. And for us, like our network at People's Action, we have for many decades engaged in rural communities in different ways and really been involved like really intensely around the struggle for family farmers. And that's why I'm so grateful for your work, Veronica. But I think we had a really deep reckoning in the aftermath of the 2016 election that we as a movement had failed, and that there were people that are suffering, and that there were places where we were not contending for that bigger we. And so we made a real commitment to invest in rural and small town organizing. And so we've grown now where we have both our member organizations and close allies who are part of the cohort are in 17 states. We've helped kind of support the development of like 35 new chapters in rural communities where there is like high levels of deaths of mortality, like sort of like death rate or intense income inequality or growing white nationalist organizing. So those are the places that we're trying to organize. And in 2018, we knocked down over 500,000 rural doors in rural communities in the build up to that election. And then last year, we had over 250,000 like conversations with rural residents to help engage them around a really like what we would call like a deep canvas conversation to help them make meaning and have a conversation about what it would look like to have a government that cares for all of us. And part of like what is inspiring this work is there's an old Hopi proverb that says like those who tell the stories rule the world. But it is also true that those that rule the world tell our stories more often than not. And so a lot of our strategy is to change and shift the stories that are told to rural people and the stories that are told about them. And it's ultimately about like, how do we, and we feel like that's what's required to really build a multiracial movement across cities, suburbs, and small towns and rural areas. And there is, I think, a deep need in this work to begin to shift the perception of kind of coastal elites in our country. And the sort of, there is this perception that rural America is like some kind of redneck dystopia. And that is not the truth. You know, people in rural areas are profoundly human. They have tremendous courage and resilience. And like all of us, they just carry all these contradictions inside of them. And that rural areas are not exclusively white. They're only 14% less diverse than our urban centers. And people of color and indigenous communities account for 75% of population growth in rural areas over the last decade. And that is why, you know, we saw like in June 30th in 2018, after the horrific events at the border, when we worked together with, as part of Families Belong Together, over half of the 700 events in solidarity with migrant children at the border, over half of them were in rural areas and small towns. And rural areas, as Eli was saying, they account for, you know, they didn't just build jails in rural areas, they have been locking up rural people. They account for 57%. You know, rural folks are only about 20% of the population, but they 57% of jail admissions, and they have the highest rate of arrest in the country. And that's why we saw last June a massive explosion of events in solidarity and outrage and mourning over the murder of George Floyd. And that's why there's been so much counter-organizing around this on the right. And so it's something we have to remember is that rural areas, as Veronica was saying, they have been shut off from economic growth for the last almost half century. And basically the extractive economy, and the tip of the spear was the sort of corporate consolidation of agriculture, but it's in every sector of the economy. Basically, it's rendered most of rural America into a sacrifice zone. So farmers right now in our country, their suicide rate is double that of military veterans. Think about that. You dedicate your life to feeding people, and your suicide rate is double to that than people who see combat. You know, right now, you know, Monica has done more work on this than anybody, but if you go to a state like Iowa, 70% of the waterways in Iowa are polluted in rural areas where we've seen a massive concentration of factory farms and places like all over the state. You know, so you have like small towns where people can't drink the water. And now even in this largest city in the state, in Des Moines, they have the largest nitrate removal facility in the world. In Des Moines, Iowa. Think about that. There is a dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico directly from all of the factory farm pollution in Iowa. And so there has been so many hospital closures in our rural communities. In most rural communities, the overwhelming majority of rural communities, we cannot give birth to children. People have to travel like more than a day just to give birth to children. So, and like in our country, even though rural areas make up about a fifth of the population, they only get like 6% of philanthropic investment. So if we want to change the stories that we are talking about, and the power and in rural communities, we have to build power and infrastructure and leadership that is grounded in rural places so they can tell their own stories. And so when we began this work, we launched with a massive deep listening campaign. And we really focused on the thing we heard more than anything is no one has asked me this before. You know, we were asking people about their hopes and dreams and suffering. And we also asked them about who do you think is responsible, right? And helping people to understand what's underneath this, what is their analysis and judgment. And what we found is deep alignment over a broad progressive agenda, huge support, 80% support for universal healthcare, for protecting our air, land, and water, preventing discrimination, investing in jobs and education. But it was really around this analysis of the cause of their suffering that we saw the greatest challenge. 80% of people thought that it was, you know, basically agreed with the idea that a wealthy few had really captured our government, and that was really the cause of our concern. But 40%, about 42% of people that we talked to blamed either Black people or immigrants. And so it's this contradiction, right? This conflict that we had to intervene. And the most commonly used word we heard was lack of jobs, healthcare, and opportunities. So real briefly, what we did is we felt like the most important thing we had to shift was this linkage between scarcity and basically between race and the economy, and the idea that immigrants and people of color were drivers of scarcity in rural areas. And so we built like a whole deep canvas program that had a massive shift in that. And all we did is we just we listened without judgment. We talked about our lives. We talked about people that we knew and loved who had moved to this country. And we talked about times when we needed support. And doing that, not only did we were able to radically shift how people viewed immigrants, and not as a threat, but we were able to build a bridge where people saw them as part of the bigger we.
Thank you so much, Adam. So I just appreciate how much it's taken us to see both systems and humanize one another. So we really want to appreciate you guys. We'll close out with Monica. If you're still with us, we'd love to switch to what you've seen, being, you know, more rooted in Detroit and bridging, as you started us off in our conversation, bridging to surrounding suburban and rural communities. What have you been learning? What were those surprising connections? What myths and misconceptions have been disrupted?
Yes, and just really appreciate all the speakers. Thank you so much. For us, it's really been about talks about growing our own souls, really going and moving from trauma into transformation. And so it was, I would say, on the other side of the contrived bankruptcy in Detroit that we know was really about targeting the privatization and regionalization of a massive water system that was under Black control. And then we also have to give historical context to how we got here. If we don't talk about the fact that the US government has divested infrastructure for over the last 40 years. If we don't talk about the fact that up until 1977, about 67 to 69% of the dollars that came in to support investment in water infrastructure came from the federal government. Now we are down to about a dismal 7 to 9% coming from the federal government. And what has happened, and this is what we hear from rural partners, this is why it's so important that Professor Gwen Winston challenged us to get in the room with some people that we weren't as comfortable with, that we may not agree with in terms of political and religious ideology, but determined that we would stay in the room with those folks until we figured a way forward for our communities. And so it's through the lens of belovedness and through the lens of the Black matriarch that we were challenged by people like Professor Gwen Winston, like the Honorable Councilwoman Joanne Watson, who is the author and architect of water affordability here in the city of Detroit, that then got replicated in other communities like Baltimore and Philadelphia. It was through the lens of those women that helped us connect to the human right to water, and how that human right actually was a universal framework. Through their eyes, that they also helped us connect it to the struggle that was happening globally for workers, as Magali so eloquently talked about. It was about the struggle for housing and land rights. It was through the eyes of now deceased and ancestor, Dr. Leslie Lowe, who was able to help us understand that what was happening in the South is that Black landowners were being displaced because of the privatization that was being implemented and imposed on them by extracting not only land and ownership, but actually denying the ability to access capital. And then we have to connect it and bring it home here today in the city of Detroit. You don't have to go all the way back through a history lesson. I can actually demonstrate to you right now. There's research from Dr. Elizabeth Mack that I put in the chat that actually affirmed that the austerity measures that we're seeing play out not only in Detroit and also played out in the poisoning of Flint, but even today, you're seeing lead levels in the city of Benton Harbor that are twice as high as that of what we saw in Flint. And what that is based on is that you have political policies on the books that last to 100 years. And it's really about extracting land from Black and brown and low wealth owners. And so when you look at Benton Harbor right now, Benton Harbor, Michigan, actually sits on lakefront property that is only a 30-minute ferry ride from Chicago. So the desire is to then use these extractive measures and these instruments, financial instruments of extraction, to claim Black land, because now you've created a crisis. And there's an instrument called the Overton window. Was crafted here in the state of Michigan, and it was funded by ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, and it was also supported by the Koch brothers. And I don't just say that to demonize one side of the aisle, because we know too, on the progressive and more moderate side of the aisle, many of the persons that facilitated this form of austerity were Black men that professed to be Democrats. It's been a collaborative effort of using these instruments to take over land, to be able to carve up union contracts, to be able to extract from the democratic process the votes of Black and brown folks. And now what we are seeing in Michigan is that Detroit, one of the Blackest cities in America, you are seeing them restructure the chairs on the deck so that there is a belief that somehow Detroit is coming back, when in actuality, it is coming back on the backs of pensioners and the low wealth members of our community. 80 for the city of Detroit was on the backs of pensioners. But if rural communities are led to believe that somehow they are paying the cost for a contrived bankruptcy, then they will never vote for policies that will bring about an equitable and just practice for the state of Michigan, for the Great Lakes, for the nation. And we say here in Detroit, as goes Detroit, so goes Michigan, as goes Michigan, so goes the nation.
That was incredible. Thank you so much, Monica, for what you've shared and for the strength of your words and how we can, and the just reminding us of how narratives are being used to pit us against one another. From what you've experienced in Detroit to reaching out to other communities and other parts of Michigan, it's just clear how much misunderstanding there is about one another, but also about the systems that are managing our resources, the people, the collusion across different groups that we might not be able to see on a daily basis as we just try to live our lives and get food and get by. So I just really appreciate this really deep cutting analysis that all of you have brought to us in terms of understanding the power of getting to know one another, of sitting and having conversations across divides, whether it's religion, as Mab mentioned, as Adam talked to us about the work of going and speaking to people about their hopes, their fears, their dreams, getting on that personal level while acknowledging that there's so much happening at the systems level. So I know we are absolutely at time. We are so thankful for the time that you all have shared with us. I would love to do a one quick round robin closing line. Our last question that we had in mind was to speak to a future vision. So what is, and we'll just, one line, it can be a picture in your head of here's what I see. What is that future vision that you see for stronger connection between rural and urban communities? What would it look like? What do you envision? Who's in that picture? What's in that picture? So let's go back the way we started. So I'll turn it back to you, Magali.
Okay, thank you. I'll be quick, and I was just going to share that I invite everyone here to follow Venceremo's work, to support the workers' efforts, because if they achieve changes, it's going to be an impact not only in the wide rural areas or in rural areas, but in the country. So I ask you to support Venceremos, to follow us, to support our campaign work, and to keep in touch with us. Thank you so much for your time, and I was so happy to participate in this event. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you. I'll pass it to Veronica.
Thank you so much for having a chance to just listen to all of this greatness. I would see a future where rural people, particularly Black belt people, were at the decision-making table to be able to make decisions about policy for their community, to be able to decide what research is being done on them, that they're included in those discussions as well. The organizing, making sure that the people are authentic, and that they truly understand the culture and the region in which they're working, and just a collective vision of hope where we all come to the table as partners. I'll stop there.
That sounds like a great table to be at. Thank you, Veronica. Mab, closing line or vision from your end?
Well, brief work I'm doing now is to try to work at the county level. Like, there's people I want to talk to and persuade, and there's people I just want to stop. And we have to stop the people who will hurt more people and destroy more things before we can build a new vision. And there's no policy if we have no Congress or functionality in governance. So I'm trying to work at that level in counties now in North Carolina. I just started doing this to find those points of resistance and those points where we need to intervene. A whole network, for instance, of military training centers, often in rural counties on the outskirts of little Black towns that can just do what they want to, but those people don't like that. And we are trying to document that and help encourage and strengthen by this information and new strategies. Those communities just say no, like define those lines where people don't want to cross them, and help to like articulate those lines and put those folks together and just close down some of these very violent strategies that are right at our doorstep. So my vision, though, is of people taking each other in and standing up for each other. You know, I was hungry and you fed me. I was naked and you clothed me. I was houseless and you took me in. You know, like to have those kinds of relationships that are not self-othering relationships, but that are of a broadly common humanity.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mab. And I'll note that I just really appreciate attention to the details of how governance and governments actually work. And so I'll note for folks again, it's in the bio on our page for this event, but some of Mab's research with the collective is in, I believe, an article from Facing South, which is also a wonderful Southern publication that I recommend checking out. Adam, what's your vision? One line.
Yeah, I think the main thing I would want to leave everyone with is, in the last century of our country, from the New Deal to the Great Society to the Black Freedom Movement, every major progressive movement in the history of our country has had effective urban and rural coalition. And there is no path to progressive power in our states or in the country without that kind of a multiracial coalition across cities, suburbs, and rural areas and towns. And if we can build that, we can actually win governing power, where we can put people and planet ahead of profits, in a place where everyone's treated with dignity and respect, where we have meaningful work, where we have the health care that we need, people have access to land and housing, clean water to drink and air to breathe, and where we're all in right relationship with each other, with one another, and with the earth. So that is sort of the vision that we are fighting for.
Thank you, Adam. Monica, we'll close out with you. One line vision of what you see in a world where rural and urban communities are more closely together.
I'm excited about the work that I'm seeing seated with young folks. We have been working through an intergenerational process where they are really able to move past trauma and geographical harms to really start thinking collaboratively and collectively. And so there is a project that we've been working on with the Flint Development Center that has the first youth water testing lab in the nation. We are also working with Toledo Junction that is doing incredible work with young folks of color and returning citizens by using technology to get them ready for the skilled trades and reentry. And then extremely excited about the fact that they are the ones that are pushing us to have a deeper conversation around anti-racist work as it relates to water, both in rural and urban and suburban communities. And so it's through their eyes that I believe that Mama Gwen Winston told us exactly correct. We are moving from tragedy into transformation. And we also embrace the work of the Reverend Dr. Joanne Watson, who told us to deputize ourselves, that no one was coming to save poor folks and Black folks, that we better decide in rural and urban communities that we are collectively worth saving and work together to accomplish that.
That is an incredible way to close us out. Thank you to all of our speakers for your time, and for our audience and our speakers dealing with these tech issues. But I'm really grateful for the time that we were able to share together, and look forward to being able to continue the conversation in other spaces. But thank you so much.